Hey, what is up, everybody? This is Stevie Breach coming to you here today live from in my truck. Right now, I am on my commute home from work. I average a commute of about 30 minutes every day to and from work every day. And a majority of the time in my truck, I like to listen to podcasts. A majority of those podcasts are wrestling-related podcasts. I know that a lot of people out there like listening to wrestling podcasts, and there's so many of them out there. I have not made this video in quite a few years, but this is going to be my top 5 wrestling podcasts that I listen to. In the past, I've done this video, and the Wrestling Observer has been number 1 on the list. Spoiler alert, today the Wrestling Observer podcast will not be number 1 on the list. So make sure you stay tuned to hear the story about why the Wrestling Observer is the longest wrestling podcast that I have listened to. But the first podcast that I ever listened to was actually a podcast about Lost, and I would give it a shout out, but it's been so long, I honestly don't remember what the name of it was. And I started listening to that podcast, and at the end of one of those episodes, they gave a shout out to another podcast, and I started listening to that. I really liked Lost that much that by the time the show was over, I think I was listening to 3 different podcasts about the television show, with people giving their thoughts and theories that I really liked listening to them. But I remember at one point not knowing what a podcast was. I remember wondering, this show is on iTunes, so is it going to charge me? Is this something that I have to pay for? In 2018, I know that there's people out there who still really don't know what podcasts are because they've never started listening to them. One of the wrestling shows I used to listen to was Wrestle Crap Radio. They're still around. They're going to be making a little bit of a comeback because their Patreon goal was reached, where they were looking to get a certain amount of money per month to do the podcast. That was reached, and they're going to start doing podcasts, at least one podcast each and every month for their listeners. And I remember going to their website and not going through iTunes, and the first time I went to start to play an episode, wondering if it was going to play, because I didn't know if my computer was up to date enough to play these, music files, not knowing really what to do. But I spend a lot of time in the truck listening to these podcasts, so hopefully if you don't subscribe to these podcasts, 4 out of the 5 are going to be free. I hope that you go out of your way to subscribe to these shows because I really dig them, and I think you will too. Number 5 on the list is going to be Cheap Heat, which comes to us via ESPN. It used to be with Bill Simmons' company before they ended up closing up shop on that one. But Simmons was one of the guys that pushed this out. It's had a few different hosts throughout its time, but during this era of Cheap Heat, it is hosted by Peter Rosenberg, who is on WWE's. He was on the Bring It to the Table show, as well as being on a few of the different pre and post shows, Raw Talk and things like that. He's there with Greg the Virgin Valentine is his co-host at this time, and I really like this show, but there's portions of the show that I really hate, to the point where I've basically gone out of my way to start a Twitter feud with the host of the show, because he does this thing where he basically talking about you have to have a life to listen to the show, and he has these sets of rules. Every time he says this, I cringe. I wish there was somewhere in the world that I could send this file to somebody and they can edit out the 2 minutes or so of this show that he does this, because I think that honestly this would be the number 1 show on this list if he didn't go into this have a life sort of thing. I really like their takes on wrestling. Even though he works for WWE, he doesn't really flaunt that in your face, and he really doesn't use that to his advantage to talk about, wrestling storylines or try to be an insider. Their take on the show is basically listening to two fans talk about wrestling, sort of guessing where they're going, hoping where they're going, and just trying to entertain everybody along the way. I think that it's a really good show, and I think most people would enjoy listening to it. It drops most of the time on Thursday nights. I listen to this one via iTunes. I just basically subscribe, and they put it on my phone, and then I'm able to listen to it. The next show, which is going to be number 4, is the Edge and Christian podcast. I really don't know what company this is with, and when it first started, I actually thought it was through WWE, and I was kind of wondering how they were getting away with swearing so much on the show. Edge and Christian are basically two retired legends. One's a WWE Hall of Famer. One of them, honestly, should be a WWE Hall of Famer. I think it's going to come sooner than later. I think that he'll get the nod in order to get in. But, they were there through the thick and thin of it, through the Attitude Era, into, wrestling into 2010, 2011, is when Edge ended up retiring somewhere. Maybe 2013 is when Christian had to tap out, but it might have been a little bit longer. And they have a lot of friends that are in wrestling. That basically they have one major guest that they'll call in and get on the show. This last week was Rey Mysterio, but they've had John Cena. Randy Orton is a guy who really doesn't do many wrestling podcasts or any wrestling interviews. But through their friendship, he's been able to be on the show. Each and every week they have a guest be on there, and most of the time you get like an hour interview, where they actually talk about, big angles that they've been in. Sometimes they don't even really talk about wrestling. Daniel Bryan was on the show. They talked a lot about, Daniel Bryan's trying to get back to wrestling, but at the same time, talking about being a father and being a husband and, giving a different side of what is going on out there. Edge and Christian, they don't really take themselves serious as, being real Hall of Famers or legends or anything like that. They do fall back on their past in wrestling, but they don't really knock what is going on in wrestling right now. And another good thing is they don't really lie about it. If they don't have time to watch a pay-per-view, or, they haven't watched it yet, they don't, just flaunt their way through it. They just say, hey, we didn't get a chance to watch the Elimination Chamber match. We're going to talk about it next week. And that is something, honestly, that I, can tip my hat at and say that, I respect that. They're not just going to go out there and be like, man, those guys really went out there and they gave it their all. I know they're battered and bruised, but they're going to get up and they're going to do Raw and SmackDown. And, they're going to gear up for WrestleMania. They're going to give you their honest thoughts. It just might not be today. It might be tomorrow. I believe that the Edge and Christian podcast drops on Thursdays. To me, for somehow it's always sort of, I listen to it on Sunday mornings when I'm, getting up and getting ready for work. And because it's a 2-hour show most of the time, I'm end up listening to it at the first hour of work as I'm walking around getting stuff done. So I really like that. Number 3 on the list is going to be What Happened When Monday, which is hosted by Conrad. And, the main guest is Tony Schiavone. It's his show, the voice of WCW. I will honestly tell you that when they announced the Tony Schiavone podcast, I laughed out loud, thinking of like, man, they are giving podcasts to honestly anyone out there. I know that Tony Schiavone, he works in radio in Atlanta, so it's not like he just fell off the face of the earth with broadcasting after WCW. He's also involved with the Georgia Bulldogs. I believe he's the voice of their basketball team. He does the minor league Gwinnett Braves, who just changed their name. I can't remember what they changed it to. But he does the AAA Braves team, does their commentating, and finds time each and every week on Monday morning. I believe it downloads at 3 a.m. my time. I think 6:05 a.m. Is when the podcast comes up, and that's almost every Monday. I listen to that knowing that it's going to be there. I laugh at this show. I learn at this show. Tony Schiavone honestly has a very, very funny side where he does not take himself too seriously. I really like it when he cusses about things. Some people knocked the show, basically saying that Tony doesn't remember anything. But to me, it's Tony not looking to lie. If he doesn't want to point blame at why something didn't work or something didn't get over, if he doesn't really honestly remember what happened. But this was a guy that sat in on a lot of the booking meetings of WCW, as well as was close personal friends of hanging out with them backstage, as well as hanging out with them in the bars with like Ric Flair and Arn Anderson, that knows the shit that went down in and out of the ring, why somebody might have been upset about a booking decision, why they might have made a certain decision. It's not just him remembering what it was like to be a commentator in WCW. They've covered a lot of shows. They do a thing where basically it's where you can fire up the WWE Network and you can watch along as they talk about a show. So sometimes the shows are about 3 hours long, but I've listened to these shows without watching the show as it goes down, and I never really find myself not entertained or wanting to hit the fast forward button. I mean, even when they have like a Buff Bagwell versus Lex Luger match that goes 12 minutes, they find a way to fill that 12 minutes with talking about stories about Buff Bagwell or Lex Luger, or just flat out just making jokes that keep you entertained, that want to keep you around for the whole 3 hours of the show. I really like this one. It really was a surprise to me. I've been listening to it since day one, when they downloaded the Goldberg episode. And I really think that if you go back, you'll find some pay-per-views or pay-per-view matches that you want to watch along with these guys. So that's it. Number 2 is going to be no surprise, but it was number 1 for 2 of these videos in the past, and this is the Wrestling Observer podcast. One of the reasons why it is not number 1 at this time is because in August, my subscription to the Wrestling Observer, which costs, I believe, $100 a year, ran out. And, one way or another, when I thought about it, I've never had that spare $100 that I wanted to throw down wrestling subscription. Right now, it was the night after Elimination Chamber, gearing up for WrestleMania. This is the first time I've ever been a subscriber that is going to pay monthly at $10.99. So, I have to figure out, is this podcast subscription for $11 worth it? To me, they bring to the table more than Dave Meltzer. Dave Meltzer, I believe, does 3 podcasts a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and the sporadic Saturday or Sunday show, mattering when UFC is on. And Dave Meltzer has, podcasts that normally last about an hour to an hour and a half, sometimes tops. They haven't done one of the Sunday shows where Meltzer and Michael Sempervini talk about wrestling for 3 to 4 hours. I forget what they called those shows, but it's been a while since they had one. But Brian Alvarez does podcasts every day, where basically he does Wrestling Observer Live, which is an actual radio show that he records and puts out for you to listen to as a podcast later in the day. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays is the Brian and Finney show, where basically on Tuesdays they watch Monday Night Raw from 20 years ago, and check those shows out. I really like listening to the archive shows of Raw and SmackDown, Raw and Nitro, because you get to remember things that you've never seen. And I've known that, even though they talk about, the Raws and the Nitros, it gets me hyped up, and I ended up going back and watching, the old pay-per-view matches themselves, because I know they're talking about the build-up to Flair versus Hogan and Uncensored in the cage match, which was actually a first blood match that I remember Ric Flair gets bloodied within the first 2 to 3 minutes of the match, and they don't call it, and Ric Flair ends up being the guy who wins the match, even though it's a first blood match. So that's one that I'm going to be checking out sooner than later, and that's only because I'm listening to these shows. On Thursdays, they call it the Potpourri Show. I think they normally watch NXT religiously, and I don't know if they take fan submissions, but they find a way to listen to everything, or to watch just a little bit of everything on that show. As well as on Thursdays, the first 20 to 25 minutes of the show is the Granny Show, where Brian Alvarez actually calls his grandma, and they talk about what is going on in her life. She answers questions about her life that are submitted over Facebook by fans of the show. And I think Granny has a pretty big following, that people listen to the Granny Show just to hear her, and they basically don't listen to any of the wrestling talk. The Sunday show, they watch old school NWA from like 25 or 30 years ago. I'm talking about like Ric Flair and Ronnie Garvin kind of stuff, with Dusty Rhodes. That's pretty entertaining. Sometimes they watch Ring of Honor and other things like that. So that's one thing to look for. Also on the show is Filthy Ford Daily, where they interview Tom Lawler, a past UFC wrestler, which is just now getting into independent wrestling. They also just started a sports show. One of the guys, I forgot his name, something Thomas. It's good. It's an honest to God good sports show, where they find Dave Meltzer was the guest on one, and hearing Dave actually talk about sports that is not wrestling is really cool. And they also have the Promise Thomas. That's his name. Something the Promise Thomas used to be in WWF as a member of the Heartthrobs tag team, I think is what it used to be. But really, really good sports show not to miss. It's good stuff. So as of right now, I believe I'm in my first week. And I listened to the Observer shows, I listened to the Archive show, and I listened to that first 25 minutes of the Granny show. Right now, I'm not 100% sure I'm getting my $11 worth, but I'll have to see what goes down after about WrestleMania to see if I want to keep up my interest in the show. Number one on the list is the show that, to me, honestly came out of the middle of nowhere. I kept hearing it get plugs on various podcasts. I heard Wrestling Observer talk about it. I heard Cheap Heat talk about it. And to me, I didn't really understand what was going to happen. I started listening to the show after about 5 weeks of them doing it. I believe the first show that really drew me in was about the Mega Powers, the build-up and the breakup of Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, because that is a wrestling storyline to me that I followed as a kid that really got me sucked into wrestling, and it's probably, to me, one of the best wrestling angles that WWF or anybody has ever done. So, of course, this is going to be something to wrestle with Bruce Pritchard, hosted by Conrad Thompson. This, of course, is another MLW wrestling podcast. This show drops every week at noon. So that's 9 o'clock my time on Fridays. And I was listening to this on Friday as it dropped each and every week, and that sort of became my day. But now I find myself having to sort of listen to this on Saturday mornings. So that's just, it's still a really good show. It's just not, I don't listen to it the minute it comes out anymore. These guys find a way to talk about wrestling and, just really draw you in. They've done some really long shows. They did a show on Bret Hart that was over 5 hours. One thing that really caught my eye a couple weeks ago was that they were doing a review of a pay-per-view. I believe it was No Way Out 2003. I really liked that show because that was one of the shows that really happened at the time. I just fell out of wrestling for like 2 or 3 years. Where I just put my foot down with the Triple H and Scott Steiner storyline and said, that's it. I'm not watching this stuff anymore. And I found myself really into it. And I remember looking at my phone at one point when they actually started talking about the actual pay-per-view instead of talking about the build-up. And they had talked about the build-up and everything that was happening in the company for, I believe, an hour and a half before they even talked about what was going on. And I was really I was learning stuff left and right. If you don't know, Bruce Pritchard is more than Brother Love. Bruce Pritchard was basically Vince McMahon's, if not, number one guy, his number two guy. This guy helped with television, whether it was writing it or producing it. He was involved with day-to-day sort of personnel things. He knows about people got signed. He doesn't like to talk about money, so he won't tell you how much somebody got paid. But, he will put guys over about how good they were. He will tell you how dumb they were. He'll tell you, he doesn't make everybody look like roses. He is a supporter of WWF. He doesn't really like to talk bad about Vince. He doesn't really talk bad about Triple H. But if something's dumb, he'll tell you it's dumb, and sometimes he'll even tell you it was his fault because it was his idea. He does really good impressions of Jim Cornette, Dusty Rhodes, Macho Man Randy Savage, that he just drops out of the middle of nowhere, whether if it's in a story or whether if it's in an advertisement that keeps you entertained, where they're making money, but at the same time you're laughing. I really think that, with them spreading out and doing live shows, I really hope that, it's kind of a long shot. I really hope that one day at the Golden One Arena, we can get another pay-per-view here in Sacramento, because I really want to see them come here. They don't do every pay-per-view. They come do it and they do a live show, but they do most of them. And seeing Conrad as well as Bruce do a live show in person, where I guess they get a little bit more in depth. Sometimes they get a little more bluer. They tell stories that they can't tell on the podcast. That gets me intrigued even more than I am right now. So that's something I'm really looking forward to it. So as of right now, that's my top 5 wrestling podcasts. We're going to go with the wrap up real fast. We're going to go Cheap Heat. We're going to go the Edge and Christian podcast. We're going to go What Happened When Monday with Tony Schiavone, the Wrestling Observer subscription, as well as Something to Wrestle with Tom Pritchard. So those are my top 5. I hope you really like those, and I'll see you guys down the road.